Hey everyone, in this tutorial, I'll walk you through my approach for painting dark angels in a traditional dark green style, adding some grim dark elements while keeping it clean. I've painted heaps of dark angels using lots of different methods and colour combinations, but so far I've found this particular approach offers the best balance of time efficiency and great looking results. I'll mostly follow the steps from my free PDF guide on Patreon, but this time swapping out the airbrush for a sponge to keep things simple and accessible. If you're into this kind of content, consider subscribing and liking the video, it really helps me out. Anyway, let's get straight into it. The main colours I'll be using are Green Skin Punch and Tenebrous Grey. These two colours will be used on the majority of the armour, and I'll start with a black primer to set a solid foundation. Now, soaking the sponge in water and squeezing out the excess so it's just slightly damp, this moisture will naturally thin the paint. We'll mix Tenebrous Grey and Green Skin Punch at roughly a 1:1 ratio. Aim for a solid base coat wherever your sponge can reach. Don't worry if some black primer stays visible, especially in those hard to reach areas. With this method, those areas will end up looking like natural shadows in the end. If you notice bubbles forming while sponging, that's usually because the sponge is overloaded with paint. Just dab off the excess on a tissue and you're sorted. For the next pass, use the same mix, but add a little extra Green Skin Punch to brighten things up. As you build up brightness, make sure to reduce both the pressure and the amount of paint in the sponge. This helps you maintain better control. Focus on areas catching the most light like the tops of knees, helmet, shoulders, and upper edges. Follow up with one more quick pass, slightly brighter again, but keep it subtle or you might accidentally drift into Salamander's territory instead of Dark Angels. Alrighty, pretty happy so far. Next up is a quick dry brush with medium olive green to highlight key edges. Think prominent spots like helmet rims, knee pads, and shoulder edges. Go gently here, removing most paint from the brush first to avoid overspill. I actually overspilled a bit on the helmet, but I'm leaving it as is because it will blend in naturally during later stages. Just focus on catching edges that protrude and are easy to highlight without hitting the flat areas. Now, blocking in some of the different elements. Dirty red on the weapon casings, Tenebrous Grey on joints and weapon grips, whole red for leathers, and a bit of light earth for the parchment. Metallics up next, gunmetal dry brushed on silver areas, then Victorian brass for gold details. Don't stress about being perfectly neat, we'll easily clean up any mistakes by using our base colours, thin down slightly to cover overspills, just use some of that green we mixed up earlier and paint over any mistakes. I've skipped forward a bit here and applied the decals. If you need help applying decals, I have a free tutorial on Patreon. I prefer applying decals before the washing stage in most cases, as the wash going over the top helps give them a naturally weathered look. In saying that, it's time for washes. I'm first applying AK White Spirit over the entire model to help the washes flow smoothly and blend naturally. Then straight from the pot, Dark Rust wash on lower areas, and Black wash on upper areas. Don't overthink the placement. Just let the washes mix organically for a convincing effect. Let it dry about half an hour, or if you're impatient like me, use a hairdryer to speed things up. Wash is semi-dry now. As you can see, it's dry on the flat areas, but still a bit wet in the recesses, which I find the best time to remove excess wash. Doing this while the wash is semi-dry makes it much easier to control. Fully dried wash can be really stubborn to remove, and if it's too wet it comes off too easily. I'm using a separate sponge slightly dampened with White Spirit. Whenever I remove oils or enamel washes, I always use a beauty blender because it's soft, doesn't damage the underlying paint, and doesn't leave behind microfibers or residue like Q-tips or cotton buds might. I've used this method for years without any issues. Gently remove the wash from flatter areas, leaving it only in the recesses. Once completely dry, we'll move on to edge highlighting. Highlighting the red gun casing with Scarlet Red, remove most of the paint from your brush first to avoid overspill or overly thick lines, then gently drag the edge of the brush along the edges. This technique helps achieve cleaner, sharper edge highlights. You can also add small chips or scratches for extra realism. If any highlights seem too strong or thick, simply glaze over them lightly with some thin dirty red to soften the effect. I also used some of the original green mix to add scratches and weathering over the decals. To push the contrast on the red even further, I added a very thin coat of tenebrous grey to the lower section of the gun. For the green armour, medium olive green again, highlight selectively, focusing mainly on prominent edges. And again, to keep your edge highlights clean and precise, remove most of the paint from your brush first to avoid thick or messy lines. Adding subtle lines, especially around the helmet and key areas, really helps define the details. If you accidentally apply too much paint or make a line that's too thick, don't stress. Just glaze over it with a thin layer of your darker base colour to quickly correct it. Highlighting other colours now, mixing a small amount of white into tenebrous grey for black areas. Let's tackle the eyes with a bit more detail now. Start by painting the eye lenses roughly using bloody red. Don't worry about perfect precision just yet. Then carefully place a small dot of white ink directly into the center of each lens. This dot creates the bright glow effect. Once dry, glaze over the white with a very thin layer of bloody red to soften the brightness and achieve a smooth glow. For extra realism, you can add a tiny dot of pure white again in the very center, and a thin touch of black wash or paint in the upper corner to boost contrast, making the eyes pop even more. Finally, with a brush lightly dampened with white spirit, gently apply pressure towards the center of the lens, removing any excess wash in the brightest area. This creates additional contrast and makes the glow look even brighter. Final step, varnishing. This is probably the most important step because it ties everything together and helps smooth out any uneven blends or inconsistent finishes. My go-to mix is 2 parts ultra matte varnish to 1 part satin. An airbrush gives the best, most even coverage, but if you don't have one, brushing it on with a large cheap makeup brush will work just fine. Just aim for a smooth, even coat. If you notice any pooling, just spread it out. Once everything's dry, finish with a quick dry brush of metallics to bring back the shine. This final touch helps your details stand out and completes the overall look. And that's it for the tutorial. If you found it helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could drop a like and subscribe. It really supports the channel. Don't forget there's plenty of free content on my Patreon if you want to dive deeper. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.